What kept the U.S. Army moving through World War II wasn't superior technology. It was a farm boy trick everyone laughed at. Across Europe, vehicles didn't fail because they were shot. They failed because mud, dust, cold, and nonstop use destroyed them from the inside. Thousands of machines broke down exactly as engineers expected. One Jeep didn't. No secret upgrades, no special design, no experimental parts. Just a routine that officers dismissed as crude and mechanics mocked as unnecessary. And then the impossible happened. That Jeep stayed operational for 973 days of war, while vehicles considered more refined and more correct failed again and again. German analysts examined captured American vehicles and concluded the same thing every time. The Americans simply over-maintained their equipment. They were wrong, because what kept that Jeep alive wasn't hidden in the engine. It was a way of thinking so ordinary that no one believed it could decide a war. If you listen to this story to the end, you'll understand how a habit that looked laughable on paper quietly created an advantage the enemy never caught up to and helped shift the balance of the entire conflict. No one noticed the Jeep at first. It carried no special markings, no experimental designation, no priority status. It looked like every other Willys scattered across Western Europe, dented, overloaded, coated in mud, and already halfway to failure. And yet, as the weeks passed, something strange began to surface. Vehicles disappeared from the line almost daily. Some were pulled back with seized engines. Others were abandoned on roadsides, stripped for parts, written off quietly in logistics reports. Entire motor pools thinned faster than anyone had predicted. But one Jeep kept reappearing, not dramatically, not heroically, just consistently. When units regrouped, it was there. When orders required rapid movement, it started. When staff officers needed transport under pressure, it ran. Day after day. That alone shouldn't have mattered except for one problem. Under combat conditions, vehicles don't fail suddenly. They fail predictably. Dust grinds engines from the inside out. Heat breaks tolerances. Moisture corrodes electrical systems. Continuous operation turns minor wear into cascading failure. World War II accelerated all of it. In Western Europe, there were no normal operating conditions. Roads were cratered, traffic was constant, maintenance windows collapsed, engines were run hot, shut down briefly, then pushed again before they ever cooled. Failure wasn't bad luck. It was expected. And yet this Jeep refused to fail on schedule. It didn't run faster than the column. It didn't haul more weight. It wasn't spared combat zones. But when others fell out of service, it didn't. At first, the explanation was simple. Luck. Luck is always the easiest answer when no better one exists. But luck doesn't repeat for months. As more vehicles cycled through repair depots, engines replaced, transmissions rebuilt, wiring stripped and reinstalled, this Jeep stayed operational. It never appeared on extended maintenance rosters. It wasn't flagged for overhaul. No engine swap. No major rebuild. No downtime worth noting. Just continued availability. That was the real anomaly. Because mechanically, there was no reason for it. Same engine, same tolerances, same materials. Often, worse conditions. By every technical assumption, it should have failed alongside the rest. Instead, it quietly exposed a problem no one wanted to confront. Military planning depends on predictability. Predictability depends on procedures. And procedures assume that equipment behaves within expected limits. A vehicle that refuses to follow those limits becomes a liability not because it's unreliable, but because it undermines the model. This Jeep didn't fail when it was supposed to. And that made people uncomfortable. Not because it was exceptional, but because it forced an unspoken question. If this one can keep going, why can't the others? No one asked it openly, but the question lingered. Informal tracking began. Nothing official, just repeated remarks. Familiar sightings, the same Jeep appearing again and again where others had vanished. The contrast sharpened. Vehicles maintained strictly by the book still broke down. Vehicles serviced on schedule still failed. Vehicles operated exactly as designed still collapsed under sustained use. And this one didn't. It wasn't the only survivor, but it was the most persistent. As the campaign dragged on, a pattern emerged. Availability mattered more than specifications. Consistency mattered more than perfection. A vehicle that was always ready quietly outperformed one that was theoretically superior but intermittently absent. This Jeep lived in that narrow margin, never pushed to extremes, never neglected, never treated as disposable. It operated in a different rhythm, one defined not by manuals or intervals, but by constant attention. That difference didn't make headlines. It didn't earn citations. No medal existed for a machine that simply kept working, but its impact accumulated. A vehicle that starts when needed means orders move faster. Meetings happen on time. Decisions reach the field before conditions deteriorate. Multiply that reliability across days, then months, and small advantages stop being small. Only later did the number appear. Not early, not triumphantly, but after everything else had worn down. 973 days. Nearly the entire war. Not a number tied to speed. Not a measure of power. A measure of presence. At that point, the question shifted. It was no longer, what makes this Jeep better? When you longs tack, it became, what assumptions are we getting wrong? A1, the answer wasn't hidden in metallurgy. It wasn't buried in design drawings. It wasn't stamped into the engine block. It lived somewhere far less glamorous. And to understand it, we have to step away from the battlefield. Not to examine technology, but to examine how this Jeep was treated every single day it was expected to survive. Because what kept it alive wasn't innovation. It was discipline applied relentlessly and almost invisibly. Military maintenance doctrine in World War II was built around a simple assumption: equipment fails in predictable ways, and those failures can be managed through standardized intervals. Change oil at a fixed number of hours. Replace parts when wear reaches a defined threshold. Repair damage after it appears. On paper, the logic was flawless. In reality, combat erased the paper. Field conditions shattered every assumption behind the manuals. Dust levels far beyond testing limits. Engines run continuously without cooldown. Moisture where none was expected. Maintenance windows that vanished the moment a unit began moving again. The manuals weren't wrong. They were incomplete. They assumed ideal conditions, conditions that did not exist for a single day on the Western Front. And that gap mattered. Most mechanics responded the same way. They worked harder, faster, and longer, trying to keep broken vehicles running. Engines were torn down repeatedly. Parts were swapped endlessly. Entire systems were rebuilt under impossible timelines. They fought failure after it happened. The Jeep that refused to die followed a different logic. It wasn't repaired more skillfully. It wasn't rebuilt more thoroughly. It was treated as if failure were optional. Instead of waiting for problems to announce themselves, it was inspected constantly. Instead of trusting intervals, it was monitored. Instead of assuming components would last until the manual said otherwise, every system was treated as already under threat. This wasn't doctrine. It wasn't policy. It wasn't approved. It was a mindset. The Army taught mechanics how to fix things. It did not teach them how to prevent failure under sustained abuse. That difference sounds subtle. It wasn't. Preventive thinking changes everything. Oil is no longer something you replace on schedule. It becomes a warning system. Filters aren't passive components. They become barriers in a war of attrition against dust. Electrical systems aren't working or failed. They are constantly degrading unless you intervene first. Most vehicles on the front were treated as durable objects. This Jeep was treated as a living system under constant stress. That perspective rewired priorities. Speed stopped mattering as much as consistency. Peak performance mattered less than predictable behavior. The Jeep was never pushed to its limits because limits are where failures are born. It wasn't driven faster just because it could. It wasn't overloaded just because it survived last time. Every choice was conservative, deliberate, repetitive, and repetition is what made the difference. While others waited for breakdowns to justify action, this Jeep was maintained as if breakdowns were unacceptable, not inevitable. This approach conflicted directly with institutional thinking. In military culture, Unauthorized modification raised alarms. Deviation from manuals was treated as risk. Excessive maintenance looked like inefficiency. From a logistical perspective, it even appeared wasteful. Why service equipment that isn't broken? Why spend time preventing problems that haven't occurred yet? The answer only becomes obvious after months of sustained operations. Because every hour spent preventing failure saves multiple hours recovering from it. Because a vehicle that never enters the repair queue doesn't compete for scarce parts. Because a system that stays within tolerances never demands heroic fixes. The Jeep's survival wasn't dramatic. It was boring, and boring is exactly what wins long wars. The more the campaign dragged on, the clearer the contrast became. Other vehicles oscillated between operational and out of service. Lime, workations. This one lived in a narrow band of constant readiness. Not perfect, not pristine, just ready. That readiness wasn't free. It required discipline that most units couldn't sustain. Inspections that happened even when crews were exhausted. Maintenance performed even when movement orders were expected at dawn. Small corrections made before they became visible problems. This was not innovation. There was no invention involved, no breakthrough component, no secret upgrade. The dangerous truth was simpler. The Jeep survived because someone refused to treat maintenance as a reaction. They treated it as a daily responsibility regardless of circumstances. And this is where the contradiction deepens. The Army valued engineering excellence. German forces arguably valued it even more. Both sides believed good design would reduce maintenance burden. But under combat conditions, that belief collapsed. Sophisticated systems required ideal care. Ideal care was impossible. The Jeep's continued operation exposed an uncomfortable reality. Design matters, but behavior matters more. A machine designed to be good enough, cared for relentlessly, outlasts a machine designed to be exceptional, but serviced intermittently. This wasn't understood at the time, not officially, which is why the Jeep's survival never became a formal lesson during the war. It spread quietly instead. Mechanic to mechanic, unit to unit, not as doctrine but as example. And that raises a critical question. If the Army didn't teach this approach, and if the manuals didn't support it, where did it come from? The answer does not lie in military schools. It doesn't come from engineering theory. It comes from a place where equipment failure isn't an inconvenience. It's a catastrophe. To understand that mindset, we have to leave the front lines entirely, not to study vehicles, but to understand the habits that shaped the person who refused to let one fail. Because the Jeep didn't survive due to a clever trick. It survived because its caretaker had learned, long before the war, that neglect kills machines faster than misuse. And that lesson was learned far from any battlefield. By this point, the legend had already formed. People spoke of a farm boy trick and a clever modification, some hidden tweak that made one Jeep immune to the abuse of war. That assumption was wrong. There was no single trick. There was no moment of invention, no sudden insight, no clever device quietly welded into place. What kept the Jeep alive was far more unsettling than that. It was a system built entirely from ordinary actions, applied with extraordinary consistency. And once you understand it, the mystery doesn't become more impressive. It becomes more uncomfortable, because nothing about it required genius, only discipline. Layer 1. Oil treated as intelligence, not a fluid. Most vehicles died from oil long before anything else failed. Not because oil was scarce, but because it was trusted. The manual treated oil as something stable, something that could be left alone until a prescribed interval expired. That logic assumed clean environments and predictable loads. Combat offered neither. Dust entered engines constantly. Metal particles accumulated faster than expected. Heat degraded lubricants long before the clock said it should. The Jeep that survived treated oil differently. It wasn't changed because the schedule demanded it. It was changed because its condition demanded it. Oil was checked obsessively. Color, texture, smell. The moment it degraded, action followed, not weeks later. Fresh oil wasn't always available, so oil was reused but never blindly. Sediment was allowed to settle. Contaminants were filtered out through improvised media. Not perfect filtration. Enough filtration The goal wasn't purity, it was damage control. Oil was no longer a consumable, it became an early warning system. Most engines died slowly and invisibly. This one was never allowed to. Layer 2. Filtration. Fighting a war of attrition. Dust was the real enemy of engines in Europe. Not dramatic, not explosive, relentless. Standard filters were designed for tolerable conditions. Combat conditions were not tolerable. Instead of trusting a single barrier, the Jeep used layers. Crude, simple, replaceable. Cloth pre-filters soaked with oil caught fine particles before they reached critical components. The main filter stayed cleaner longer. Wear slowed. Nothing revolutionary. But the difference compounded daily. Engines don't fail because of one bad moment. They fail because thousands of tiny insults accumulate unchecked. This Jeep blocked those insults earlier than others. Layer 3. Cooling. Preventing the invisible kill. Overheating didn't announce itself with drama. It warped tolerances, degraded seals, shortened lifespans quietly. Most vehicles were cooled reactively, addressed only after temperatures spiked or systems failed. This Jeep was cooled preventively. The cooling system was treated as fragile, not robust. Debris was flushed before it accumulated. Water quality was monitored obsessively. Additives scavenged from wherever they could be found prevented scale buildup. Heat transfer stayed efficient longer. Again, nothing impressive. Just attention applied before damage occurred. Layer 4. Electricity killing corrosion before it started. Electrical failures crippled vehicles without warning. Moisture crept into connections. Corrosion built slowly. A single bad ground immobilized an entire system. Most repairs happened after failure. This Jeep never waited. Connections were inspected constantly, cleaned, protected with basic sealants. Wires were treated as vulnerable, not durable. The result wasn't perfection, it was predictability. Systems worked because they were never allowed to degrade unnoticed. Layer 5. Bearings, tires, and the discipline of small things. Bearings were never allowed to dry out, never overpacked, never ignored. Tires were rotated religiously. Pressure was checked constantly. Underinflation, the silent killer of mobility, was never tolerated. None of this saved hours in a single day. It saved weeks over a year. And that was the point. The pattern no one wanted to admit. When you step back, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The Jeep wasn't stronger. It wasn't faster. It wasn't better engineered. It was simply never allowed to drift far from optimal condition. Other vehicles oscillated between working and broken. 17 checked. This one lived in the narrow band between. That band required effort, daily effort, unrewarded effort, invisible effort. There was no glory in it, and that's why it was dismissed. In military culture, heroics are visible. Maintenance is not. The irony is brutal. The thing everyone searched for, the clever trick, never existed. What existed was something far less appealing. Routine, repetition, refusal to cut corners. This wasn't brilliance. It was refusal to accept decay. Why this worked when everything else failed. The manuals assumed maintenance was episodic. This approach treated maintenance as continuous. The manuals assumed failure was inevitable. This approach treated failure as optional. And under sustained combat conditions, that difference decided everything. Because once a vehicle entered the repair pipeline, it was effectively gone. Parts were scarce. Time was scarcer. Facilities were overwhelmed. A vehicle that never entered the pipeline didn't compete for survival. It simply stayed. That was the advantage. And it compounded daily. The most dangerous misunderstanding. From the outside, this looked like excess. Too many inspections, too much time spent on equipment that wasn't broken. German analysts would later describe this behavior as wasteful. They misunderstood the equation. They counted hours spent maintaining. They didn't count hours saved by never repairing. They measured efficiency in parts used. They didn't measure availability. This wasn't a technical failure. It was a conceptual one. The Jeep didn't survive because of a trick. It survived because someone rejected the idea that machines fail on their own. Machines fail because people let them. And that belief applied relentlessly kept one vehicle alive for 973 days. But the most revealing part of this story isn't how the Jeep survived. It's how others reacted once they noticed. Because while American mechanics slowly began copying these habits, German analysts looked at the same evidence and reached the wrong conclusion. To understand why, we have to shift perspective. Away from the motor pool, away from the Jeep, and into the rooms where German engineers tried and failed to explain what they were seeing. From the German side, the evidence was impossible to ignore. Captured American vehicles were piling up by late 1944. Jeeps, trucks, half-tracks, seized intact or abandoned during retreats. They were catalogued, photographed, dismantled, and studied methodically. German engineers expected to find an explanation. Superior materials, hidden reinforcements, design shortcuts masked by American mass production. They found none. By German standards, the American Jeep was crude, low-compression engine, simple carburation, basic suspension, electrical systems that lacked refinement. On paper, it should not have endured prolonged combat better than German equivalents. And yet, it did. This contradiction triggered frustration. Reports described the Jeep as mechanically unsophisticated, yet noted its persistent operational availability. Analysts struggled to reconcile those two facts. To German engineers, durability was supposed to come from design excellence, precision tolerances, optimized components, superior metallurgy. Maintenance was a secondary concern, a support function meant to preserve engineering perfection. American vehicles violated that philosophy. They sacrificed refinement for simplicity. They accepted inefficiency in exchange for ease of service. German analysts noticed this, but they misread its significance. They interpreted frequent American maintenance as waste. Reports described excessive oil changes, repeated inspections, constant servicing of components that appeared functional. To German eyes, this confirmed a familiar belief. The Americans were compensating for inferior engineering with material abundance. They could afford to waste oil. They could afford to overservice. They could afford inefficiency because their industry produced endlessly. That conclusion felt comfortable. It preserved German confidence in their own doctrine. If American vehicles lasted longer, it was not because they were better. It was because America was richer. But this explanation ignored a critical reality. By late 1944, American supply lines were stretched thin. Fuel shortages were common. Replacement parts were not infinite. Maintenance crews were exhausted. This was not a system drowning in abundance. And yet the maintenance behavior persisted. That should have been the clue. Instead, German analysts doubled down on design logic. They compared blueprints. They measured tolerances. They evaluated component quality. What they never evaluated was behavior. They studied the machine. They ignored the human routine surrounding it. And that blind spot mattered. German maintenance doctrine assumed ideal conditions, proper tools, trained specialists, controlled environments. When failures occurred, the response was thorough and slow. Engines were rebuilt to factory standards. Transmissions were restored meticulously. Under peacetime conditions, this approach worked. Under combat conditions, it collapsed. Vehicles waited for parts that never arrived. Repairs required facilities that no longer existed. Time disappeared. A broken vehicle was often lost permanently. American practice accepted imperfection. Instead of restoring systems fully, they stabilized them. Instead of chasing optimal performance, they prioritized availability. German engineers saw this as laziness. They did not understand it was strategy. The Jeep that survived 973 days embodied that difference. It was never restored to ideal condition. It was never perfect. Icy. It was kept ready. And readiness beat perfection every time. The misunderstanding went deeper than mechanics. It was cultural. German engineering culture prized mastery over systems. American field culture prized adaptability. German doctrine trusted design to solve problems. American practice trusted people. That difference shaped outcomes. As German vehicles became increasingly complex, their maintenance burden grew heavier. As American vehicles remained simple, their maintenance became more flexible. The Jeep did not outlast German vehicles because it was superior. It outlasted them because it tolerated imperfection and was constantly corrected before failure. German analysts never framed the problem that way. They asked, "Why does this design work?" Askily. They should have asked, "Why does this routine work?" You want to the live about of these. By the time that question began to surface, it was too late. German units were immobilized not by enemy fire, but by mechanical attrition. Operational plans collapsed because vehicles were unavailable when needed. The Jeep's quiet persistence exposed a truth German doctrine could not absorb. Wars are not won by the best machines. They are won by the machines that show up. And showing up depends less on engineering brilliance than on daily discipline. The irony is sharp. German engineers were correct about one thing. The American Jeep was inferior by traditional engineering metrics. That was precisely why it survived. It asked less of its caretakers and rewarded attention instead of punishing deviation. German vehicles demanded ideal conditions. American vehicles accepted reality. The Jeep that survived 973 days did not embarrass German engineering. It exposed the limits of engineering without adaptability. And in doing so, it revealed a lesson no report could capture. A machine designed to tolerate human behavior will outlast one that demands perfection from it. This wasn't understood in Berlin. It was learned painfully on frozen roads, abandoned depots, and stalled columns. By the time German commanders recognized that availability mattered more than elegance, the war had already slipped beyond recovery. And that brings us to the final question. If this maintenance philosophy worked so well, if it kept vehicles moving while others failed, why wasn't it adopted formally during the war? The answer lies in what this approach demanded from the people applying it. Because keeping a machine alive for 973 days required something few could sustain. Not intelligence, not innovation, but relentless, unglamorous discipline. And that discipline came at a human cost. To understand it, we have to look beyond machines and at the person who refused, day after day, to let one fail. Keeping a vehicle alive for 973 days did not happen by accident. It happened because someone paid a price every single day. The Jeep did not maintain itself. It did not survive because of luck, and it certainly did not survive because of relaxed standards. It survived because someone refused to accept even minor neglect. That refusal came with consequences. Every morning began the same way. Before movement orders, before briefings, before the day unfolded, the Jeep was inspected. Oil checked, not just level, but condition. Cooling system examined for contamination. Belts and hoses tested for early fatigue. Electrical connections inspected before corrosion became visible. None of this took long, but it was never skipped. During movement, the Jeep was monitored constantly, not casually, not occasionally, religiously. Engine tone, temperature behavior, response under load. Small changes were noticed immediately, because small changes are where failures begin. At halts, even brief ones, the vehicle was checked again. Leaks were caught early. Loose connections tightened. Wear addressed before it announced itself. At night, when others rested, maintenance continued. Oil changes at shortened intervals. Filters cleaned and reused. Bearings serviced. Electrical systems sealed again and again. This was not efficiency. It was obsession. And obsession extracts payment. Hours that could have been spent resting were spent working. Energy that could have been conserved was invested in prevention. There was no recognition for it. No commendation existed for a vehicle that never failed. No citation was awarded for problems that never occurred. The work was invisible. And that invisibility is why few were willing to copy it fully, because this approach demanded something rare in war. Consistency without applause. Most soldiers are pushed to act heroically in moments of crisis. This required heroism in monotony, day after day, without variation, without relief. The Jeep never became a symbol during the war. It didn't appear in propaganda. It didn't receive a nickname known beyond its unit. But quietly, its reliability altered outcomes. A staff officer arriving on time meant coordination held together. A message delivered without delay meant orders arrived before conditions worsened. A meeting that happened in person prevented misunderstandings that could have cost lives. These effects are impossible to quantify precisely, but they compound over days, over weeks, over years. Availability is invisible until it disappears. German forces learned this lesson the hard way. As their vehicles broke down, coordination slowed. As coordination slowed, reaction times increased. As reaction times increased, opportunities vanished. The Jeep never changed the course of the war by itself, but it contributed to a system that did, and that contribution went unrecorded. When the war ended, the Jeep's story did not become legend immediately. There were no ceremonies, no preservation orders. It was inventory, and inventory had rules. Surplus equipment was processed efficiently. Vehicles were categorized, returned, transferred, scrapped. The Jeep that survived 973 days was cut apart like thousands of others. Steel reclaimed. Components melted down. The record erased, physically, if not historically. The person who kept it alive returned home quietly. No parade. No especial distinction. Just a return to work repairing farm equipment, the same way he had repaired military equipment. Preventing failure. Fixing problems before they mattered. He rarely spoke about the war. When asked about the Jeep, he dismissed the attention. It wasn't special, he said. It just needed care. Here's lives. That answer frustrated historians. They wanted innovation. They wanted genius. They wanted a secret. There wasn't one. The lesson was too plain to be dramatic. Machines fail because people stop paying attention, and attention is exhausting. The Army eventually learned this lesson, not during the war but after it. Maintenance doctrine shifted slowly. Preventive inspection became emphasized. Condition-based maintenance replaced blind intervals. Modern military logistics quietly adopted the philosophy that had kept one Jeep alive, not because of one story, but because the data eventually supported it. The irony remains. The thing that changed outcomes was never a weapon, never a machine, never a breakthrough. It was a habit that demanded discipline without reward, a habit that punished neglect immediately but rewarded care only over time. German engineers believed sophistication would save them. American field practice accepted reality instead, and reality favored the side that kept its equipment running. The Jeep that survived 973 days did not prove American engineering superiority. It proved something far less comfortable. That success often belongs to those willing to do unglamorous work relentlessly, long after enthusiasm fades, long after recognition disappears. That truth is not limited to war. It applies wherever systems are stressed, where failure accumulates invisibly, where discipline matters more than brilliance. The Jeep survived because someone refused to let decay go unnoticed. Not once, not ever. That is why they mocked the farm boy trick. That is 100 in places, and that is why, in the end, they stopped laughing. Because the war was not won by perfection. It was won by the things that kept moving when everything else broke down. 973 days. One vehicle. No miracle. Just work applied every single day. And that, more than any machine, is what carried the war forward.